If you open almost any history book, the story of the ancient world reads like a script written entirely by Rome. We are taught that the Roman legions were an unstoppable machine, that they marched out from Italy, crushed the Greeks, annihilated the Carthaginians, conquered the Gauls, and essentially painted the known world red. The narrative is simple. Rome was the undisputed master of antiquity. But that narrative is a lie. There was a boundary where the Roman war machine simply stopped. A line drawn in the desert sands of the ancient Middle East, where Roman ambition went to die. If you crossed that line, you weren't fighting disorganized tribes or decaying kingdoms. You were walking into the territory of a superpower that matched Rome in wealth, outclassed them in mobility, and eventually inflicted upon them the most humiliating defeat in Roman history. They ruled an empire that stretched from modern-day Turkey to the borders of India. They controlled the lucrative Silk Road trade routes. They lasted for nearly 500 years. Yet today, their cities are buried in sand, and their name is barely a footnote in most classrooms. They were the Parthians, and for centuries, they were the absolute terror of the Roman Empire. But to understand why the Parthians were so incredibly deadly, you first have to understand how Rome fought its wars. By the 1st century BCE, the Roman military had perfected a very specific style of warfare. The core of their power was the heavy infantryman, the legionary. He was heavily armored, highly disciplined, and equipped with a large shield and a short sword. The Roman strategy was brutal but effective. March directly at the enemy in a massive, impenetrable block, absorb their attacks with a wall of shields, and then crush them in close quarters, hand-to-hand combat. It was essentially a massive walking meat grinder. It worked against the Greeks. It worked against the Gauls. So when Rome decided to invade Parthia, they expected to use the exact same strategy. But the Parthians didn't fight like anyone Rome had ever encountered. If the Roman legion was a slow-moving tank, the Parthian army was a swarm of hornets. The Parthians didn't rely on infantry. Their entire military doctrine was built around the horse. And they perfected two distinct types of cavalry that, when combined, were an absolute nightmare to fight. First, you had the light horse archers. These men rode without armor, emphasizing pure speed and maneuverability. They were armed with powerful composite bows that could punch through armor at incredible distances. Their signature move was so devastating that we still use a phrase for it today: the Parthian shot. A Parthian rider would charge toward the enemy, fire an arrow, and then immediately turn his horse around to retreat. But as he galloped away, he would twist his upper body completely backward in the saddle and fire another precise, lethal shot at the pursuing enemy. To a Roman soldier, this was maddening. You couldn't catch them, and even when they were running away, they were still killing you. But the horse archers were just the distraction, because once they had broken your formation, the Parthians unleashed their true monsters, the cataphracts. These were the heavy cavalry, but they weren't just men in armor. The rider and the horse were entirely encased in overlapping scales of bronze and iron. They looked less like ancient soldiers and more like metallic medieval knights arriving centuries early. They charged into the disorganized Roman lines with massive lances, shattering the infantry. The Roman military machine was built to fight standing armies. They were completely unprepared to fight an enemy that refused to stand still. And one Roman general was about to learn this the hard way, in a battle that would shock the ancient world. The year is 53 BCE. Marcus Licinius Crassus is arguably the wealthiest man in the history of Rome. He had crushed the slave rebellion of Spartacus. He was part of the first triumvirate, sharing power with Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. But Crassus had a problem. Caesar and Pompey were celebrated military heroes. Crassus was mostly known for being incredibly rich. He wanted military glory to cement his legacy. So, without the official approval of the Roman Senate, Crassus decides to invade the Parthian Empire. He gathers an immense army of roughly 40,000 men, 7 full Roman legions, and marches them directly into the arid plains of modern-day Turkey, near a town called Carrhae. Crassus expects to march into a major Parthian city, accept their surrender, and march home a hero. Instead, waiting for him in the heat haze of the desert is a Parthian general named Surena. Surena hasn't brought a massive army. He only has about 10,000 cavalry. By Roman logic, Crassus outnumbers him 4 to 1. This should be an easy victory. But Serena is a tactical genius. As the Romans advance, the Parthian horse archers surround them. They don't engage in hand-to-hand combat. They simply ride in circles around the massive Roman square, firing a relentless, unceasing rain of arrows into the tightly packed legionaries. The Romans try their standard defense. They lock their shields together into the famous testudo, or tortoise formation. But the Parthian composite bows are so powerful that the arrows are literally pinning the Roman soldiers' hands to their shields. Crassus assumes the Parthians will eventually run out of arrows. But Serena has anticipated this. He has brought a massive supply train of 1,000 camels, loaded entirely with spare arrows. The bombardment is infinite. Desperate, Crassus orders his son, Publius, to lead a cavalry charge to break the circle. The Parthians immediately retreat. Publius chases them out into the desert, thinking he has them on the run. It is a trap. Once Publius is far enough away from the main Roman army, the Parthian heavy cataphracts turn around and annihilate him. A few hours later, a single Parthian rider gallops up to the main Roman lines. He is carrying a spear, and on the end of that spear is the severed head of Crassus's son. The morale of the Roman army completely shatters. As night falls, Crassus attempts to retreat, but the discipline of the legions has broken. The retreat turns into a chaotic, terrifying slaughter. Over the next few days, 20,000 Roman soldiers are killed. Another 10,000 are captured and marched off into slavery deep inside Parthian territory. It is one of the most devastating, humiliating defeats in the entire history of the Roman Republic. As for Crassus himself, he is captured trying to negotiate a truce. The historical accounts of what happened next vary, but the most famous legend perfectly summarizes the irony of his death. The Parthians knew that Crassus had invaded their empire purely out of greed for more wealth. So, according to the legend, they executed him by pouring molten gold down his throat. The Battle of Carrhae sent shockwaves all the way back to the Senate floor in Rome. For the first time, Rome realized they were not invincible. They had met their match in the East. What followed wasn't a quick revenge campaign. It was the beginning of a centuries-long brutal conflict that resembled a modern Cold War. Rome and Parthia became the two superpowers of the ancient world. They fought proxy wars over the kingdom of Armenia. They engaged in massive diplomatic standoffs. They established a heavily fortified, highly militarized border along the Euphrates River. Every time a new Roman emperor took power, they felt the pressure to solve the Parthian problem. Julius Caesar was actually planning a massive invasion of Parthia to avenge Crassus right before he was assassinated on the Ides of March. Mark Antony tried to invade a decade later and suffered a humiliating retreat, losing tens of thousands of men to starvation and Parthian hit-and-run tactics. The Parthians weren't just a military threat, they were an economic powerhouse. They controlled the central hub of the Silk Road. If Rome wanted silk from China or spices from India, those goods had to pass through Parthian territory. The Parthians became incredibly wealthy, simply by acting as the ultimate toll booth between the East and the West. So why, if they were so powerful, did they disappear from history? Why aren't there massive Parthian ruins drawing millions of tourists today? The answer lies in how they were organized. The Parthian Empire wasn't a highly centralized, bureaucratic state like Rome. It was a feudal system. It was an alliance of powerful, independent noble families who pledged loyalty to a central king. This meant they were incredibly resilient to outside invasion, because there was no single capital city you could capture to destroy the empire. But it also meant they were constantly fighting each other. The Parthians didn't fall because Rome finally figured out how to beat them. They fell because they tore themselves apart from the inside. Centuries of internal civil wars between rival noble families slowly bled the empire dry. By the early 3rd century CE, the Parthians were exhausted, and a new, highly aggressive Persian dynasty, the Sassanids, rose up from within their own territory, overthrew the Parthian kings, and took control of the empire. The Parthians were gone, and because they didn't leave behind a massive written history of their own, most of what we know about them was written by the Romans, who hated them. Their legacy was slowly buried under the sands of time. History is famously written by the victors. But the story of the Parthians reminds us that sometimes history is written by the survivors who want to forget how terrified they actually were. The Romans spent centuries trying to erase the memory of Carrhae. They wanted the world to believe that their legions were an unstoppable force of nature. But the Parthians proved that even the greatest military machine in the world could be broken in the desert. So the next time you hear a story about the glory and invincibility of ancient Rome, remember the empire that made them bleed. Remember the phantom riders of the East.